He stood alone, quiet and unnoticed, but in a few hours the world would realize they'd ignored the most powerful man in the country. At first glance, he looked like just another passenger. Hoodie on, no flashy jewelry, no assistance, no visible security. People walked past him with sleepy eyes, wheeling suitcases and sipping cheap coffee from vending machines. Nobody greeted him, nobody stared, and that's exactly what he wanted. Beneath the surface, this man carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders. He had just returned from Europe, where he'd been in high-level meetings with diplomats discussing gold reserves, regional security, and Africa's self-determination. The room had been full of suits and ties, yet here he was now, dressed like a university student waiting for a flight. To the cleaning staff, sweeping the floor, he was just another face. To the woman checking tickets behind the counter, he was one name among many. But to the people of Burkina Faso, he was their symbol of resistance, their hope for a new beginning, President Ibrahim Traore. There was something poetic about how he moved. No guards, no media frenzy, no shouting aids. He carried himself like a man who knew true power didn't need to be displayed. As he sat down near Gate 37, the airport buzzed around him, soft flight announcements in French and English, the occasional child crying in the distance, a group of tourists laughing over photos on a tablet. He was in the middle of it all, yet separate. Alone, not lonely. Calm, not aloof. He greeted the gate staff with a soft bonjour and a smile that was warm, not forced. His boarding pass was tucked in his jacket pocket, not handed off to someone else. He didn't cut any lines. He didn't expect any special treatment. In fact, he hoped for none. For Ibrahim, this was more than just a flight. It was a moment to observe, to be among everyday people, to feel the pulse of the world as it is, not as it's presented in high-level meetings. He didn't need people to recognize him. He wasn't after applause. His job, as he saw it, wasn't about being served, but about serving. That's why he chose to walk through airports like any other traveler. That's why he chose to fly commercial. He believed that true leadership meant never forgetting what it felt like to stand in line, to wait your turn, to smile at someone without expecting them to bow. In a world obsessed with titles and appearances, Ibrahim Traore lived by different rules. But those rules were about to be tested, not by an enemy army, not by a political rival, but by a stranger who would judge him on the one thing he could never hide, his skin. Meanwhile, several gates down, the mood was completely different. A sharply dressed French executive with slicked-back hair and a high-end briefcase was causing a quiet commotion. His company badge hung from his neck like a trophy, and his attitude announced him even louder than his tailored suit. He had just been informed that business class was full. For most people, that would be disappointing. For him, it was unthinkable. He wasn't just another flyer. He was a CEO of a multinational energy corporation with operations scattered across West Africa. He had power, money, connections, and he expected the world to know it. He didn't shout, not yet, but his tone was already slicing through the calm air like a blade. "This is unacceptable," he said to the airline staff, who fumbled with their tablets and murmured nervous apologies. He reminded them, in crisp, arrogant French, of his strategic partnerships across the continent. "I'm here on behalf of projects that keep your lights on," he hinted, not even realizing the irony. The employees nodded, apologized, promised to check again. But the fact remained. Every seat in business class had been taken, and one of those seats, 2A, was occupied by a man this CEO would have never imagined as his equal. As he continued his monologue, full of entitlement and passive threats, the airline quietly dispatched a senior flight attendant to the plane. Her job was to find a solution, and she already knew where she'd look first, not at her VIP guest, not at the white businessman in 3C, but at someone who, in her mind, looked out of place. She hadn't even boarded yet, but the decision had already begun forming in her head. She'd find someone who looked ordinary, replaceable, and without realizing it, she was walking straight into a lesson she would never forget. Claire stepped onto the aircraft with a sense of quiet authority. Her uniform was pressed to perfection, her hair pinned neatly back, and her expression was that practiced blend of politeness and power. The kind flight attendants learn after years of managing egos at 35,000 feet. She walked briskly down the aisle, her heels tapping softly against the floor, clipboard in hand. She wasn't flustered, but she was definitely focused. The message she'd received from the gate was clear. A very important passenger was upset, and a seat in business class had to be made available. She didn't need to be told who should give it up. She already had an idea. Her eyes scanned the rows with quiet precision, not just for seat numbers, but for faces. Specifically for someone who wouldn't cause too much trouble if asked to move. And then she saw him. 2A, a man in a dark hoodie, sitting quietly near the window, scrolling through his phone. No visible sign of wealth, no tailored suit, no Rolex, no assistant waiting on him, just a young black man sitting alone. To her, it looked like a mismatch. She paused for only a second before making her way to him. A soft smile on her face, she leaned in. "Bonjour, monsieur. May I see your boarding pass?" Her tone was pleasant, almost rehearsed, like someone trying to be polite while already expecting a certain outcome. Ibrahim looked up, met her eyes calmly, and handed her the pass without a word. She checked it, frowned slightly, checked again. The name and seat were correct. He belonged there. But something in her expression betrayed her thoughts. She didn't feel like he belonged. Not in business class, not in 2A, not next to passengers wearing cufflinks and sipping sparkling water. She handed the ticket back with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and walked away without explanation, but she wasn't done. A few minutes later she returned. This time the polite facade had a slight edge to it. "Excuse me, monsieur," she said. "We may need to make a small adjustment. Another guest requires this seat. Would you mind relocating to economy? You will be compensated." Her words were wrapped in courtesy, but the meaning was clear. They wanted him to move, not because he did anything wrong, not because of any legitimate reason, but because someone more important was coming aboard. Ibrahim glanced up from his phone, eyes steady, voice calm. "And why me?" he asked, his tone not aggressive, just curious. Her smile stayed frozen on her face. "No specific reason, sir," she replied, trying to sound neutral. "Just a seating adjustment for operational purposes." She was lying, and they both knew it. He blinked once, slowly. "So, a guest more important than me?" he said, softly but deliberately. Her smile faltered for just a second, and that's all it took. Something in her shifted, a flash of discomfort, quickly masked. "We would really appreciate your cooperation," she added, but it was already too late. The question hung in the air. Other passengers began to glance over, sensing tension. Not enough to intervene, but enough to become silent witnesses. Ibrahim leaned back in his seat, exhaled slowly, and said 5 words that would shift the course of the entire flight. "No, I will stay here." He didn't raise his voice, he didn't argue, he didn't explain, and that's what made it powerful. Claire was stunned. She blinked, then cleared her throat. She wasn't used to being told no, especially not by someone who, in her mind, should have been grateful just to be there. She forced another smile, but this time it was tighter. "Sir, I insist. This is for operational reasons," she repeated, her tone slightly colder now. Ibrahim didn't flinch. "If it's truly operational," he said, locking eyes with her, "then why am I the one being asked? Why not someone else?" There was a pause, one of those silences that stretch and pull at the edges of a moment, revealing more than words ever could. Claire didn't answer. She couldn't. She turned without a word and walked briskly toward the galley, face flushed, frustration growing. But her reaction wasn't just about disobedience, it was about control slipping through her fingers, and worse, in front of other passengers. She returned minutes later, trying a different tactic. This time she walked past Ibrahim and approached another black man in business class, then another. One by one, she quietly leaned over their seats and made the same request. Would they consider moving? Could they relocate to economy? Each time, the pattern was clear. She wasn't looking at boarding passes. She was looking at skin color. That was her mistake. Her second one, to be exact. Because now passengers were watching more closely. Some began to whisper. A few frowned, but still, no one spoke up. That's when Ibrahim stood. He didn't make a scene. He didn't shout. He simply stood and spoke. His voice was calm, but it landed with the weight of a judge's gavel. "Enough," he said. Claire froze. The entire cabin seemed to inhale at once. "You are making decisions based on appearance, not on tickets," he said. "And that," he paused, "is discrimination." Claire's mouth opened, but no words came out. She was rattled. Her hands tightened on the clipboard. She stammered something about policy, about procedure, but it sounded weak even to her own ears. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to sit down," she said, trying to reassert herself. "Please, don't cause a scene." He looked her straight in the eyes, and for a second her breath caught. There was something in his gaze, a quiet power, a fearlessness that came not from pride, but from purpose. She had tried to remove a man she thought was invisible, but now all eyes were on him, and whether she realized it or not, the ground beneath her feet had just shifted. The tension in the cabin thickened like humidity before a storm, heavy and inescapable. Passengers who had once been buried in newspapers or distracted by their phones were now quietly attentive, eyes darting between the flight attendant and the man who had refused to be moved. Some looked puzzled, others uneasy, but no one said a word. The atmosphere was laced with discomfort, the kind that grows when injustice is present but unspoken. Ibrahim remained seated, hands relaxed on the armrest, breathing slowly, his posture unthreatening but immovable. His silence wasn't weakness, it was control, a deliberate calm that unnerved those who expected him to lash out, to raise his voice, to validate their assumptions. Instead, he chose stillness, and in doing so, he forced everyone around him to see what they would rather ignore. Claire returned to the front of the cabin, her composure thinning, her professional mask beginning to crack at the edges. She whispered something to another crew member, her eyes quickly flicking back to 2A. There was a quiet scramble, hushed conversations, tablet screens being tapped and checked again. But nothing had changed. The CEO still needed a seat in business class, and Claire still believed someone had to be displaced, someone who wouldn't fight back. She didn't say it out loud, but her actions had already spoken for her. That's why she kept circling back to the same type of passenger. Not the man in the pinstripe suit, not the middle-aged woman with the designer handbag, only the ones who looked like they didn't belong, in her eyes at least. She made another pass through the cabin, eyes locked onto faces, not names. Her target was no longer just Ibrahim, it was anyone who looked too young, too brown, too quiet to push back. She stopped beside a young African man, maybe in his late 20s, who sat 2 rows behind. He had headphones around his neck and a boarding pass resting on his lap. Claire leaned down, fake smile in place, and said softly, "Sir, I'm sorry to disturb you, but we need to make a quick adjustment. Could you please move to economy?" The man blinked, confused. "Why me?" he asked. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. She simply extended her hand for the pass. That's when Ibrahim stood up again. This time it wasn't just resistance, it was intervention. His voice was no louder than before, but now it carried the weight of someone who had seen enough. "Stop," he said. Everyone turned. Claire froze mid-sentence. Ibrahim stepped forward slightly, still composed, but now undeniably commanding. "You've asked 3 men to move," he said. "All of them black, all of them silent, and you never once looked at anyone else." Claire's eyes darted around, searching for support, but none came. Even the crew member she'd been whispering to earlier now looked unsure, their eyes on the floor. "You are making decisions based on skin, not tickets," Ibrahim said. "That's not a seating issue, that's discrimination." The words landed like a gavel. Claire tried to respond, but her voice caught. "Sir, please," she managed, "don't escalate the situation." But he wasn't the one escalating anything. He was simply stating what everyone else had already started to feel. Some passengers nodded subtly, others looked away, ashamed they hadn't spoken sooner. The illusion of order had cracked, and now the truth was pouring in. Claire retreated again, flustered, humiliated, not just by the confrontation, but by the way her authority had unraveled in front of everyone. For her, this had started as a simple task: reshuffle seats, keep the VIP happy. But now she had stepped into something deeper, something she wasn't prepared to face: the consequences of treating people as if their worth could be judged by how they looked. She returned to the galley, whispering frantically to the cockpit, seeking backup, a way to salvage control. But none of it mattered anymore. The damage had been done. And as she plotted behind the scenes, Ibrahim sat back down. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply resumed his quiet observation, his fingers tapping softly against the armrest, eyes fixed on the window. He wasn't just reacting. He was absorbing everything, every word, every look, every silence, because this wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about something that had happened to millions of people in subtle ways for far too long. He didn't need to shout about it. The truth was loud enough on its own. Back in the gate area, the French CEO checked his watch impatiently. He was still waiting for confirmation that a seat had been secured. His assistant whispered something in his ear. He gave a curt nod. He assumed things were being handled, as they always were, and soon he would be seated comfortably, champagne in hand, flown across Africa like a visiting king. What he didn't know was that inside the aircraft, the seat he believed belonged to him had become the stage for a reckoning, one that would soon reveal the very thing he'd failed to recognize. Real power doesn't always arrive with noise and privilege. Sometimes it wears a hoodie and asks quiet questions that change everything. The boarding process finally came to an end, and the cabin doors closed with a soft, mechanical thud. The murmurs of conversation died down as passengers settled into their seats, adjusting headrests, flipping through magazines, buckling belts. In seat 2A, Ibrahim Traore remained still, his gaze resting on nothing in particular. Around him, the air remained tense. The confrontation hadn't exploded, but it lingered, an invisible fog of discomfort that clung to every row. Claire hadn't returned. She'd withdrawn to the front, rattled but not defeated, still trying to process how her control of the situation had slipped from her hands. She whispered to her colleagues now, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. Something about that man's calm had unsettled her. Something in his stare had pierced through her uniform, her authority, her assumptions. Minutes later, the French CEO was finally led onto the aircraft. His polished shoes struck the floor like he owned the cabin, and the air shifted around him, not because of who he was, but because of how he carried himself. Head high, lips curled into the ghost of a smirk, he barely looked at the passengers as he walked past them. He radiated that smug entitlement of someone who had spent his life getting doors opened for him, someone who expected the world to bend. He reached his seat and barely noticed Ibrahim. To him, 2A was just another face. The fact that this man had defied being moved didn't register. Claire, now regaining her footing, greeted the CEO like royalty. She offered him champagne, fluffed his headrest, assured him that everything was now taken care of. She didn't even glance in Ibrahim's direction. Her shift in attention was sharp, deliberate, as if she could pretend the earlier moment hadn't happened if she simply ignored it hard enough. The plane began to taxi slowly, the low rumble of the engines blending with the subtle clicks of seatbelts being tightened and tray tables locked in place. The aircraft rolled toward the runway, and soon the nose lifted off the ground, rising into the pale sky. Outside, French soil disappeared beneath the clouds. Inside, everything seemed to settle into routine. But it wasn't normal anymore. Not really. The plane was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. The tension from earlier hadn't dissolved. It had simply gone underground, like an ember buried in ash, waiting to catch again. Claire avoided any further contact with Ibrahim, but her actions betrayed her discomfort. She walked past his row a little faster than the others. She smiled only when she was talking to someone else. She made a show of serving the CEO, laughing at his dry jokes, nodding enthusiastically at his self-congratulatory remarks about his work in Africa. He leaned back, wineglass in hand, and said loudly enough for a few to hear, "Burkina Faso should be grateful for our presence. We're modernizing things, bringing order." Claire nodded, unbothered, blind to the irony that the very man he referred to was sitting 2 seats away, silent and unmoved. And Ibrahim said nothing. He didn't correct the man. He didn't reveal who he was. He didn't shift in his seat or even sigh. He simply stared forward, out the window at the sky, not avoiding the moment, but rising above it. He understood that power doesn't always need to be declared. Sometimes its strongest expression is restraint, because Ibrahim wasn't just playing the long game, he was the long game. A man carrying the future of a nation in his mind, while others still tried to fit him into boxes built by the past. Farther back in the cabin, a few passengers had noticed what was happening. A nurse from Bobo Dioulasso leaned over to her neighbor and whispered, "Do you know who that is?" Her voice was quiet, but full of certainty. The woman next to her shook her head. "That's our president," she said. "They're humiliating him and don't even realize it." The neighbor's eyes widened, but she said nothing. It wasn't fear that kept her quiet. It was respect. If the president himself hadn't spoken, then she wouldn't either. Not yet. The hours passed slowly. The lights dimmed. Most passengers dozed off or scrolled through entertainment screens, oblivious to the weight of what had just taken place. But Ibrahim didn't sleep. He sat awake, watching clouds drift past the window, his thoughts circling like the jet above the Atlantic. He wasn't angry, he was focused on how this moment, small in scale, massive in symbolism, would be remembered. He hadn't needed to raise his voice, he hadn't needed to prove himself. And yet, a silent lesson had already been given. The flight attendant who had judged by appearance, the executive who assumed influence came only in tailored suits, the passengers who had stayed quiet, and the president who had said 5 words and changed the course of the flight without ever standing above anyone. He didn't need to. He just had to be exactly who he was. As the plane descended into Ouagadougou, the morning sun lit the sky in warm gold, reflecting off the red earth below. The aircraft glided lower, and a few passengers stirred awake, stretching, yawning, preparing for landing. But out the windows, something strange caught their eyes. A line of black SUVs, military vehicles, and uniformed guards waiting near the runway. There was no mistaking it. This was a full presidential convoy. "Is there some kind of military operation?" one foreigner asked, leaning to get a better view. "No," someone else answered softly. "That's protocol for someone important." The CEO chuckled. "They must be here for me," he said smugly, adjusting his collar and flashing a grin at Claire, who nodded along with him, completely unaware of the storm they had just flown into. The plane's wheels touched down, the cabin filled with the gentle bounce of landing. Seatbelts clicked back into place. Claire moved briskly, clipboard in hand, already preparing to escort her VIP guest off the plane first, bypassing the crowd. She had no idea what was about to happen. None of them did. Not the passengers, not the CEO, not even Claire herself. But the man in 2A, the one they had ignored, underestimated, and tried to remove. He knew. He'd known from the start. And now, the truth was about to greet them all the moment that cabin door opened. The aircraft rolled slowly toward its designated gate, its engines winding down, but the anticipation inside the cabin was climbing. From the windows, the full scale of the scene outside became visible. It wasn't subtle. Black SUVs lined the tarmac in perfect symmetry. Dozens of elite guards stood at attention, faces firm, rifles at their sides. A flag fluttered in the wind near the lead vehicle, the national emblem of Burkina Faso. Behind the formation stood high-ranking officials, dressed in formal attire, waiting beneath the rising heat of the morning sun without flinching. The image looked more like the welcome for a head of state than anything the passengers were expecting. It didn't make sense to most of them. Whispers started traveling row by row. Some passengers leaned over each other to get a better look. "Are we landing in the middle of a conflict?" someone asked. "Why so many soldiers?" another wondered aloud. Nobody had answers. Not yet. Claire peeked out the window with a puzzled look. Her eyebrows furrowed, lips parted slightly. She hadn't been informed of any special arrivals. As far as she knew, the only noteworthy passenger on board was the French CEO seated a few rows away, currently sipping his second glass of champagne, thoroughly impressed with himself. When he caught sight of the vehicles, he chuckled and turned to her. "They pulled out the whole army," he said with mock modesty. "I suppose they knew I was coming." Claire smiled in agreement, more out of habit than sincerity, but even she couldn't shake the strange feeling rising in her chest. Something wasn't adding up. The aircraft came to a complete stop. The ding of the seatbelt sign turned off. The captain's voice came over the speaker, offering a standard greeting in French and English, wishing everyone a pleasant stay. But outside, the formal stance of the soldiers remained unchanged. Not a single one moved. It was too precise, too ceremonial. Something important was about to happen, something no one on board had prepared for. Then, as passengers began gathering their belongings and standing to stretch, the cabin door opened and a tall officer in a black beret stepped onto the plane. His boots echoed against the metal floor, the only sound in the suddenly silent cabin. He walked down the aisle with a steady pace, scanning every face as he passed. When he reached row 2A, he stopped and came to attention. With one swift motion, he raised his hand in a crisp salute and spoke in a voice that rang with clarity and pride. "Monsieur le Président, bienvenue chez vous." For a full second, the cabin froze. It was as if time paused, trapping everyone in the moment. Eyes snapped toward Ibrahim. The murmurs stopped mid-sentence. Claire's expression crumbled in real time. Her breath caught, and the clipboard slipped slightly in her hand. The French CEO sat motionless, a small crack appearing in his confident posture as the words sank in. Ibrahim Traore stood slowly, not with flair or arrogance, but with quiet dignity. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His very presence had become the answer to every question, the answer to every assumption that had passed silently between the rows of that flight. As he stood, passengers began to realize what they had just witnessed. The man in the hoodie, the man asked to move, the man they thought was ordinary. He was the president of Burkina Faso. One woman near the back gasped. Another covered her mouth. The nurse from earlier whispered, "I told you." The officer turned to Claire and the CEO. His eyes were hard now, formal. "You two, come with us," he said. Claire blinked, her voice barely escaping her throat. "Wait, me?" she stammered. "Why? I was just—" But he cut her off coldly. "You are being taken for questioning." She looked at the CEO, who had gone pale. He stood slowly, stammering, I didn't know," but the officer's gaze didn't waver. "That does not excuse disrespect to the head of state," he said. "You will come, now." Claire looked around in desperation, searching the faces of her fellow crew members for help, for support. But none came. Not one person spoke for her. They watched silently as she and the CEO were escorted down the aisle, flanked by uniformed guards. Their faces, once full of confidence and pride, were now clouded with confusion and fear. Passengers leaned aside to make room. Some shook their heads, others stared in disbelief. The same aisle where Claire had once walked with authority now became a path of shame. Outside, the heat of Burkina Faso's sun washed over the tarmac, but the only thing burning was the weight of realization settling on everyone watching. Claire and the CEO were placed into separate black vehicles, each surrounded by guards. There were no shouts, no protests, just silence. The kind of silence that follows when people are faced with the consequences of their own arrogance. Ibrahim Traore stepped off the plane into the blazing light, where a crowd had already started to gather beyond the airport fence. Cheers erupted, cameras flashed, ministers greeted him with firm handshakes and proud nods. The president had returned, but not just as a leader. This time he returned as a symbol, a man who had been judged, dismissed, and disrespected, and who had responded not with outrage, but with grace. Inside the terminal, a small group of journalists gathered, unsure of what had just unfolded. Ibrahim stood before them briefly, speaking without anger, without theatricality. His words were measured, but sharp. In Burkina Faso, we do not measure a man by the color of his skin or the cut of his suit. We do not bow to wealth. We respect character, dignity, and service to our people. That is the Africa we are building. No slogans, no political theater, just a statement that resonated across borders. The story exploded. Within hours it was everywhere. Footage from the airport leaked online. Images of Claire and the CEO being led away, head down, surrounded by guards. Clips of the presidential salute on the plane. Social media lit up with hashtags, Respect Africa, I Stand with Burkina, memes, posts, debates, videos. Young Africans across the continent celebrated not just the moment, but what it meant. For too long, they had watched their leaders treated with disrespect on international stages. For too long, they had swallowed the subtle and not so subtle messages that power didn't belong to them. But now, here was a man who had walked among them, quiet, patient, proud, and who had flipped the script with nothing but presence and principle. Back at the Ministry of Justice, Claire and the CEO were both formally charged. Public insult toward the head of state, racial discrimination, abuse of authority. The French embassy tried to intervene. Calls were made. Diplomats scrambled. But Ibrahim was clear. This is not a colony. This is a sovereign nation. Justice here is not for sale. No immunity, no special treatment. The law would take its course. Air France issued an apology, the usual corporate script, full of regret and lessons learned. But the people weren't interested. In Burkina Faso, citizens began calling for boycotts. Across Africa, commentators asked how many more stories like this had never been caught on camera. Claire broke down during questioning. She sobbed, "I didn't know who he was." The investigator, unmoved, replied, "You didn't need to. You only needed to treat him like a human being." The CEO attempted legal maneuvering, but the courts remained firm. No influence could erase what had happened. And through it all, Ibrahim Traore said little. He returned to his duties quietly, visiting schools, inspecting infrastructure, planning military reforms. He didn't ride the wave of media attention. He didn't post about the moment, because he didn't need validation. He had something greater, the trust of his people, and the knowledge that dignity had won. That flight became legend, a story that mothers would tell their sons, that youth would carry in their hearts, a president in a hoodie, a seat in 2A, a quiet refusal that echoed across the continent, and a lesson that the world, especially those who still saw Africa through the lens of old power, would not soon forget.